It was well past midnight when Elon Musk finally pushed away from his desk. The soft glow from his computer screen illuminated the empty office, and outside, the city of Austin buzzed with life in the distance. The clock on his screen read 1:18 a.m., but sleep was elusive. His body was exhausted from back-to-back meetings, decisions, and constant emails from his teams. He should have been resting, preparing for the day ahead. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more problems, and more people needing his attention. It was a relentless cycle, one that left little room for anything outside of his companies and ventures. But Elon had always been someone who did his best thinking in the quiet of the night, when the world around him slowed down. With a sigh, he opened his social media feed, letting his fingers scroll aimlessly. Most of it was noise, the usual barrage of comments, opinions, and requests. People tagged him in posts asking for money, sharing personal opinions about his work, and making demands for his time. Normally, he ignored it all, but tonight, something caught his eye. It was a photo of an older woman, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was kind, her smile gentle. There was a warmth in her eyes that tugged at something deep within him. He paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. He knew that face. Of course, he knew it. It was a face he hadn't seen in years, but one he would never forget. This was Mrs. Caroline Foster, his high school science teacher. The post was brief, a simple request for help. Help save our mom, Mrs. Caroline Foster, beloved science teacher for over 30 years, needs heart surgery. Elon's heart skipped a beat. His mind immediately raced back to the days when he had been a student in her classroom, sitting in the back row, daydreaming about rockets, technology, and the future. Things that seemed so far away for a teenager with few friends and big dreams. He clicked on the post, his fingers trembling slightly. The link took him to a fundraising page, where the details were laid out in stark, heart-wrenching clarity. Mrs. Foster needed a heart valve replacement. The surgery was scheduled to cost $300,000. Her insurance and teacher's pension covered less than half. Without the surgery, the doctors had given her less than a year to live. Elon stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. He'd known that Mrs. Foster wasn't well, but he hadn't known it was this bad. He read further. $1,256 had been raised, donated by 89 people over the past 3 months. It wasn't enough. Far from it. Not nearly enough to cover the cost of the surgery, let alone her recovery. This can't be happening, Elon thought as his gaze fixed on the number. He stared at the page, and the memories came rushing back. He remembered the long afternoons after school when Mrs. Foster had stayed behind to help him with his science projects. She was the teacher who saw potential in him when no one else did. When he had failed a science experiment that was supposed to be his big breakthrough, she had stayed with him late into the night, helping him figure out what went wrong. Science is about failure and learning from it, she told him then. The only real failure is giving up. That one moment had changed everything for him. It wasn't just about the science project. It was about the belief she had shown him. She was the first person to believe in him. Elon leaned back in his chair, his thoughts spinning. Mrs. Foster wasn't just any teacher. She had changed the course of his life. There had been other teachers, of course, but none had taken the time to understand him the way she did. She didn't just teach science. She taught him how to question everything, how to look at the world through a lens of curiosity and possibility. It was Mrs. Foster who had inspired his passion for technology and innovation. Her belief in him had been the spark that lit the fire that drove him toward creating companies like SpaceX and Tesla. But now she was in desperate need of help. Elon rubbed his tired eyes. It had been years since he had thought about her. He had meant to keep in touch after high school. He had even promised himself that he would, but life moved fast. College, then Zip2, PayPal, and all the other ventures. Along the way, he had lost touch with the people who had mattered most, including Mrs. Foster. He recalled the last day he had seen her in person. She had handed him a card with the words, "Shoot for the moon. Even if you miss, you'll land among the stars." At the time, it had seemed like a cheesy sentiment, something you'd see on a motivational poster. But he had kept that card for years, and now, those words seemed like the perfect reminder of the teacher who had always pushed him to aim higher, to reach beyond what seemed possible. But now here he was, sitting in front of his computer, knowing that the woman who had believed in him so many years ago was facing a battle for her life. And he had the means to help. Elon reached for his phone, then hesitated. This wasn't something he could delegate to an assistant. This was personal. He clicked back to the fundraising page and found the contact information for the organizer. The name was familiar. Zoe Foster, Mrs. Foster's daughter. He tapped out an email, then deleted it, unsure of how to begin. How do you reach out to someone who had changed your life, but with whom you hadn't spoken in decades? After a few moments, he typed out a simple message. Subject: offering help for Mrs. Foster. Dear Zoe, my name is Elon Musk. I was a student of your mother's at Peltoria Boys High School. Mrs. Foster was not only the best teacher I ever had, but she changed my life in ways that I am still discovering. I recently learned about her health situation, and I would like to help in any way that I can. Would it be possible for us to speak tomorrow? I've included my private number below. Best regards, Elon Musk. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. It was the right thing to do. Then he got up from his chair and walked over to the window, looking out at the bright lights of the city. There was so much he had accomplished, so many people and projects that demanded his time. Yet here was one person who had helped him shape his future. And now she was struggling. His phone buzzed less than a minute later. A reply from Zoe. Subject: offering help for Mrs. Foster. Mr. Musk, is this really you? Mom has always talked about you. She kept so many newspaper clippings of your accomplishments over the years. If this is really you, yes, we can talk. I'll call tomorrow at 10 a.m. your time. Mom doesn't know I've reached out to any of her former students. She's always been too proud to ask for help. Best regards, Zoe Foster. Elon smiled as he typed back, It's really me. I'll be waiting for your call. He felt a sense of relief, but also a growing determination. This wasn't just about paying for a surgery. It was about something much bigger. Mrs. Foster had given him the gift of belief when no one else would. Now it was his turn to give back. The woman who had shaped his future deserved to see just how far her influence had reached, and that was when he began to form a plan. As the morning sun began to rise, painting the Austin skyline with hues of orange and pink, Elon sat in his office, staring at the screen of his computer. He had barely slept, his mind racing through the memories of his time in high school. Memories that seemed so distant but had shaped his entire life. It was strange, almost surreal, to think that a single teacher had had such a profound effect on the trajectory of his life. Yet as Elon thought about it, the memories of his science classes with Mrs. Caroline Foster flooded back with vivid clarity. Elon had never been a typical student. In fact, he often felt like an outsider. At Peltoria Boys High School, he had been the kid who corrected his math teacher's mistakes on the second day of school, the one who asked questions that no one else seemed to care about. His peers didn't understand his obsession with science, his deep curiosity about the universe, and his dreams of creating technology that could change the world. To them, he was just another freak, or know-it-all, as they had often called him. But not Mrs. Foster. She had always seen something in him that no one else did. From the first day she walked into the classroom, Mrs. Foster had recognized the spark in Elon. It wasn't just that he had an aptitude for science. It was the way he saw the world, the way he questioned everything, in the way he wanted to make it better. Elon remembered the first day he'd walked into her class. He had been nervous, starting at a new school, in a new country, with a completely different set of rules. The door to the science lab had opened, and in walked a woman who, unlike the other teachers, had a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. Mrs. Foster wasn't the type to drone on with boring lectures. Her presence was dynamic, her voice full of energy. She had a way of making even the most complicated scientific concepts seem approachable. Good morning, class. I'm Mrs. Caroline Foster, your new science teacher. I know some of you may have heard rumors about me, but let's start fresh, shall we? Her smile was contagious, and Elon immediately felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. Mrs. Foster had a way of making everyone feel like they were capable of something extraordinary. She didn't just teach from the textbook. She made science come alive. Real-world applications, thought experiments, and questions that pushed her students to think critically about what they were learning. Elon had always been more interested in the why of science than the how, and she understood that. It wasn't long before Elon found himself staying after school, asking questions that other students weren't interested in. Most of the teachers had simply dismissed his curiosity, but not Mrs. Foster. She encouraged it. She asked him questions, probing deeper into his thoughts, pushing him to find the answers himself, rather than handing them to him on a silver platter. Elon would linger in the classroom long after the bell rang, and Mrs. Foster would stay with him, offering suggestions, guidance, and, most importantly, belief. Elon had been working on a science project for the school's annual fair, a new kind of battery design that he was convinced could revolutionize energy storage. But the night before the fair, disaster struck. His prototype failed spectacularly. The wires had melted and smoke had poured out of the casing. Elon sat on the floor of the science lab, staring at the charred remains of his project, feeling completely defeated. He had poured weeks of work into it, and now it was ruined. That's when Mrs. Foster found him. She had been cleaning up her desk when she saw him sitting there, his head in his hands, clearly upset. "What happened, Elon?" she had asked, her voice full of genuine concern. "It's ruined," Elon had muttered, his voice cracking. "I worked so hard and now it's all gone." Rather than offering empty words of comfort, Mrs. Foster had pulled up a chair and sat down beside him. "Let's take a look together," she had said. "We don't give up because of a failure. We figure out why it didn't work, and then we try again." They had worked side by side that night, trying to understand what went wrong. Mrs. Foster had never made Elon feel like he was failing. Instead, she showed him how to analyze his mistakes, how to learn from them, and how to approach the problem from a different angle. By the time the janitor had come to kick them out of the building, they still hadn't solved the issue. But she had promised him they would try again the next day. The next morning, at 6 a.m., they were back in the lab. Mrs. Foster had brought in materials from her own home workshop to experiment with. "Try using aluminum instead of copper," she had suggested. "It's lighter, and while it's less conductive, it might just be the solution we need." Elon had been skeptical, but Mrs. Foster's unwavering belief in his potential pushed him to give it a try. By the time the fair opened later that day, they had a working prototype, one that wasn't perfect, but it worked. Elon hadn't won first place, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had learned an invaluable lesson about failure and perseverance. Mrs. Foster had taught him that the path to success wasn't always smooth, but with determination, anything was possible. It was moments like those that shaped Elon's character and fueled his drive for innovation. Mrs. Foster had never treated him like a problem student. She had seen him for who he truly was, a curious, ambitious kid who was just trying to make sense of the world. She had never doubted him, even when he doubted himself. As Elon sat at his desk that morning, thinking back on those memories, he realized just how much Mrs. Foster had shaped his thinking and his career. She had been more than a teacher. She had been a mentor, a guide, and a source of unwavering support during some of the most pivotal years of his life. The lessons she had imparted to him had stayed with him, shaping his approach to problem solving, his relentless pursuit of innovation, and his belief that anything was possible, even in the face of failure. Now, as he looked at the email from Zoe, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Mrs. Foster had believed in him when no one else did. It was time for him to return the favor. He couldn't let the woman who had given him so much be left to struggle. He couldn't let her go without showing her just how much her impact had shaped the world around her. The phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Zoe, confirming their call at 10 a.m. Elon smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. It was time to help Mrs. Foster, but more than that, it was time to show her the extraordinary impact she had had on the world. An impact that had rippled out in ways she could never have imagined. The phone buzzed in Elon's hand, signaling the arrival of a new message. He glanced down at the screen. It was from Zoe Foster, Mrs. Foster's daughter. He'd been waiting for this moment ever since he'd sent his email. Zoe had promised to call at 10 a.m., and now it was exactly that time. Elon took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering nervousness. Even with all his accomplishments and experience in high-stakes situations, there was something different about this. Picking up the phone, he tapped the green button to answer the call. "Hello, Zoe," he said, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed a sense of urgency. "Hi, Mr. Musk," Zoe replied, her voice warm but carrying a hint of caution. "It's really you," Elon chuckled softly. "Yes, it's really me. I'm glad we could connect." Zoe hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Mom's been really proud of you. She kept your clippings over the years. Every time you were in the news, she'd tell us about how you were doing. But I'm sure you're aware of how proud she is. She's also a little too proud for her own good. I'm sure she'd be mortified if she knew I was reaching out to you." Elon nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I know. Mrs. Foster was always very independent, and she'd never ask for help, no matter how much she needed it. I remember that about her, but that's why I'm reaching out. She helped me when I needed it most, and now it's my turn to help her." There was a pause on the other end of the line as Zoe processed what Elon had said. Thank you," she finally said. "I really appreciate it. You can imagine how difficult it's been. She hasn't even let us tell anyone about the fundraiser, not even close friends. She's just too proud." Elon's voice softened, filled with empathy. "I understand. Pride can be a powerful thing, especially for someone like your mother. She's the type of person who believes in self-reliance, in standing on her own 2 feet. But sometimes even the strongest people need help. She gave so much of herself to others, and now it's time to make sure she gets the help she deserves." Zoe let out a long breath. "I'll admit, I've been worried about how she's been handling everything. She keeps saying that she's lived a good life and doesn't want us going into debt for her. It's been so hard trying to convince her to even consider this surgery. But the doctors have made it clear it's her only chance." Elon leaned back in his chair, his mind whirring with thoughts. "Zoe, I want to do more than just help with the surgery. I've been thinking about how I can show your mom just how much she's meant to so many people, how much she's influenced lives like mine. Mrs. Foster changed the course of my life. She didn't just teach me science, she taught me how to think differently, how to approach problems from new angles. And I know I'm not the only one. There are so many people out there whose lives she's touched in ways she probably doesn't even realize." Zoe was silent for a moment, as though weighing his words. "You're right," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "She's done so much for others, and she never asked for anything in return. She just wants to teach, to make a difference. If she knew that her legacy, what she's done for all of us, was recognized, that would mean everything to her." Elon felt a surge of determination. He could sense that this was the key. It wasn't just about paying for the surgery. It was about showing Mrs. Foster that her life's work hadn't gone unnoticed. It was about letting her see that the seeds she had planted had grown into something extraordinary. "Zoe, I have an idea," he said, his voice firming with resolve. "But it needs to be a surprise. I don't want her to know about it in advance. I'm planning to create something that will show her just how much she's meant to this world." Zoe paused, then replied cautiously, "What exactly are you planning? I trust you, but I need to know more before we move forward." Elon took a breath. "I want to help her see the impact she's had, not just on me, but on every student she's ever taught. I'm going to reach out to other former students of hers, gather their stories, and show her that her belief in them wasn't just a passing thing. It changed their lives. These stories, these people, they're all part of her legacy. And once she sees that, I want to help make sure that legacy continues." Zoe sounded surprised but intrigued. "You want to bring together all of her former students?" "Yes, I think if we can show her how many lives she's touched, it will help her understand just how much she's contributed. I want her to know that her work is still alive and growing, even after all these years. I'm going to create something that will carry on her mission." Zoe's voice softened. I've never heard her speak like this before. She's always so humble, so focused on the present. She doesn't like to think about the past. I understand, and I'm not doing this to embarrass her. But Mrs. Foster has left a mark on this world, whether she realizes it or not. And it's time she sees that her influence is still shaping the future. Zoe was silent again, as if contemplating Elon's words. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Okay, Mr. Musk, I'm on board. What do you need from me?" Elon smiled to himself. First, I need to know the details of her surgery, where it's being done, the costs involved, and any other medical information you can share. I also need a list of her former students, especially those she's helped in unique ways, whether it's getting into college or starting a career in science. I want to connect with them. Zoe quickly agreed. I'll get that to you, and thank you. You don't know how much this means to us, especially to Mom. I just want to make sure she knows how important she is, Elon said, his voice softening. I'll be in touch soon. You have my number if you need anything. After the call ended, Elon sat in his chair for a moment, letting the weight of the conversation sink in. This was no longer just about helping a former teacher. It was about honoring a woman whose influence had shaped the world in ways she would never fully understand. And as he prepared to take the next steps, he realized that the real gift he could give Mrs. Foster wasn't just paying for her surgery. It was showing her the depth of her impact, the lives she had changed, and the future she had helped create. The following days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and research. Elon's mind was consumed by the idea of showing Mrs. Caroline Foster just how far her influence had reached. His desire to help her had grown into something much bigger than just a financial contribution. It had become a mission to make sure she understood the profound impact she had had on the world, especially on the lives of her former students. But in order to do that, he needed to gather the right people, the right stories, and, most importantly, the right message. He had already spoken to Zoe, who had provided him with the information he needed about her mother's surgery. Mrs. Foster's procedure was scheduled at a top hospital in Boston, but the medical bills were still overwhelming. Despite the surgery's importance, Mrs. Foster had refused to burden her family with the full costs, insisting on finding a way to make do with what little was raised through the fundraising campaign. Elon couldn't let that happen, not after all she had done for him and countless others. Elon had a simple idea in mind. He would not only pay for the surgery, but would also create something that would honor Mrs. Foster's life's work. He would gather stories from her former students, people whose lives she had changed in ways they would never forget. He would show her that her belief in them had paid off, that her sacrifices had made a tangible difference. But there was a problem. Mrs. Foster had always kept her personal life and her impact on her students very private. She had never sought recognition, and her pride had made it difficult for her to accept help, even from those who owed so much of their success to her. Elon knew he had to be strategic. This couldn't be a simple donation. It had to be something that would resonate deeply with Mrs. Foster, something that would make her understand that her influence had not only changed the lives of her students, but also helped shape the future. He began reaching out to former students of Mrs. Foster's. He used his own networks, reaching out to people in his circles and asking his staff to help track down anyone who had been a student in her science classes at Peltoria Boys High School. Over the next few days, the responses came flooding in: emails, texts, and even direct messages on social media. Former students shared stories of how Mrs. Foster had shaped their futures in ways both big and small. Some spoke of how she had encouraged them to pursue their dreams when they felt lost. Others recalled how she had taken the time to give them extra tutoring after school when they were struggling. Many spoke of how Mrs. Foster had opened their eyes to the world of science and technology, worlds they had never even considered before. One by one, Elon compiled the stories. Some of the names were familiar to him from his own school days, though many were new to him. There was Rachel, a woman who had become an engineer at NASA. Mrs. Foster had let her use the school's science lab after hours because her parents didn't believe in science for girls. Then there was Marcus, a pediatric surgeon, who recalled how Mrs. Foster had encouraged him to take the difficult path in medicine despite his failures. Fabo, an environmental scientist, had spoken about how Mrs. Foster had taught him the importance of protecting the planet when he was just a teenager. Each story was more moving than the last. It was clear that Mrs. Foster's influence had stretched far beyond the classroom. Elon's heart swelled as he read the messages. He had known Mrs. Foster was special, but this was something else entirely. These people weren't just successful in their fields. They were making real-world changes that had an impact on everyone around them. They were living proof of the lessons she had imparted, of the way she had shaped their thinking and encouraged them to push the boundaries of what was possible. And now they were all willing to help him honor her. In addition to collecting these powerful stories, Elon also set to work on the next part of his plan, a surprise that would be so big, so impactful, that it would leave Mrs. Foster speechless. A science center. Not just any center, but one that would carry her name. A place where children from all backgrounds could experience the joy of science and learn from the lessons she had taught so many. It wasn't just about a building, it was about creating a legacy that would live on, long after she was gone. Elon knew that Mrs. Foster's greatest wish had always been to make science accessible to all, especially those who couldn't afford expensive programs or camps. She had often talked about creating a hands-on science center for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, but financial constraints had always held her back. This was his chance to make her dream a reality. Elon knew the process would take time. This wasn't something that could be built overnight, but he also knew that this center could serve as a living testament to Mrs. Foster's life's work, to the hundreds of students she had inspired, and to the countless children who would benefit from her vision. The next step was to bring the project to life. Elon reached out to the best architects, engineers, and educational experts. He had already purchased the land where the center would be built, a vacant lot near Mrs. Foster's old school. The center would be designed to reflect her passion for hands-on learning and discovery. It would be a place where children could experiment, explore, and grow. Not just in science, but in their belief in themselves and their ability to make a difference in the world. Meanwhile, he continued to gather the stories of Mrs. Foster's former students. He created a private online group where people could share their experiences and memories, and began to arrange for a special event, something that would surprise Mrs. Foster and allow her to see, firsthand, the legacy she had built. It would be a celebration of her impact, a way to show her that she had made a real difference. It would also be a way for all of her former students to reconnect and share how her teachings had influenced their lives. Elon wasn't sure how he would keep the surprise under wraps, but he was determined to make it happen. Mrs. Foster had always believed in the power of education and science. It was time to show her just how much she had changed the world. As the days passed and the project started to take shape, Elon found himself feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about making headlines or being recognized. It was about honoring the woman who had helped shape the person he had become. It was about showing her that her work had mattered and that she had changed the world in ways she could never have imagined. The next step was reaching out to Zoe again. Elon had a plan, and it was time to start making it happen. Elon Musk spent the next few days in a whirlwind of activity. Between his commitments to his companies, the countless calls and emails, and the ever-growing stack of to-dos, his mind never wandered far from his mission to honor Mrs. Caroline Foster. The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how much she had shaped not only his life, but the lives of so many others. She had been the one teacher who had believed in him when no one else did. And now he was determined to make sure she knew the full extent of her impact. The idea of creating the Caroline Foster Science and Discovery Center had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just a tribute to her work, it was a way to ensure that her vision for the future of science education would be realized in a way that could touch the lives of generations to come. Elon had already secured the land near Peltoria Boys High School, where the center would be built. The location was perfect, close to the school where Mrs. Foster had taught for over 30 years, and near the community she had spent her life serving. The plans were already being drawn up by a team of top architects and designers, each one working tirelessly to create a space that would reflect Mrs. Foster's love for hands-on learning, her commitment to making science accessible to all, and her unshakable belief in the potential of young minds. But this project wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about the people who had been shaped by Mrs. Foster's teaching. Elon knew that in order to truly honor her, he had to bring together the many students whose lives she had changed. So he took the next step, reaching out to as many of her former students as possible. Through his team, Elon had tracked down dozens of people who had passed through Mrs. Foster's classroom over the years. Some were local, others had gone on to do remarkable things in fields like engineering, medicine, and environmental science. One by one, Elon began to connect with them. He sent personal messages, telling them about Mrs. Foster's health situation, her incredible impact on their lives, and the project he was working on. As expected, the response was overwhelming. One by one, former students responded, sharing their own stories of how Mrs. Foster had helped them achieve their dreams. Rachel, the NASA engineer, was one of the first to respond. She had been a shy, introverted girl when she first entered Mrs. Foster's class, unsure of herself and uncertain about her future. But Mrs. Foster had seen something in her. "You're capable of more than you realize," she had told Rachel. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do." Rachel had gone on to become one of the leading engineers at NASA, working on space exploration projects that would eventually help humanity reach Mars. Then there was Marcus, the pediatric surgeon. Marcus had failed a crucial exam during his first year of medical school. He had been ready to give up, but Mrs. Foster had taken him under her wing, giving him the support he needed to keep going. "The real failure is giving up," she had told him. "You can always learn more, but only if you keep trying." Marcus had gone on to become a respected pediatric surgeon, saving countless lives. Fabo, the environmental scientist, had a similar story. He had struggled to find his place in the world until Mrs. Foster had introduced him to the concept of sustainability and environmental protection. She had encouraged him to pursue his passion for the planet, even when others doubted him. Today, Fabo worked with international organizations to protect endangered ecosystems around the world. Each of these stories, and many more, reminded Elon of the profound influence Mrs. Foster had on her students. It wasn't just about the science. It was about the way she made her students feel seen, heard, and capable of achieving greatness. The fact that so many of her former students had gone on to become leaders in their fields was proof of the lasting impact she had. As Elon read through these stories, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Mrs. Foster had given him something priceless: belief in himself. She had taught him that failure wasn't something to be feared, but something to learn from. She had shown him that perseverance, curiosity, and hard work could lead to extraordinary things. Now it was time to return the favor. It wasn't just about helping her with the surgery, it was about helping her see the legacy she had created and how it was still alive and thriving in the world around her. Once he had gathered a sufficient number of stories, Elon knew he had to move on to the next phase of his plan, creating an event that would surprise Mrs. Foster and show her just how much her work had impacted the world. He envisioned an intimate gathering of her former students, each one sharing their personal stories of how she had shaped their lives. But it would be more than just a celebration. It would be a reminder to Mrs. Foster of her own worth and the far-reaching effects of her selfless dedication. To make the event even more meaningful, Elon decided to invite Mrs. Foster to visit the site of the future Science Center. He knew this would be a difficult request for her. She wasn't the type to accept grand gestures or special treatment, but he also knew that seeing the plans for the center would be a powerful moment for her. It would show her that her work was far from over, that her legacy was not just a series of memories, but a living, breathing institution that would continue to inspire and educate generations of students. Elon reached out to Zoe, explaining his plan to surprise Mrs. Foster with a visit to the site. Zoe, though hesitant, agreed, knowing how much it would mean to her mother to see the project in person. "Just promise me one thing," Zoe said, her voice tinged with concern. "Don't tell her anything about the center until the visit. I don't want her to feel like we're trying to force her into something." "I promise," Elon replied. "This is all for her, Zoe, to show her just how much she's done for all of us." With that, the plans were set into motion. Elon would gather Mrs. Foster's former students for the event, and he would personally invite her to see the site of the new Science Center. It would be the perfect way to show her that her influence hadn't just shaped individuals, it had changed the course of entire fields of science, technology, and medicine. The next steps would be critical. The event had to be kept a secret, and the site visit had to be carefully orchestrated. But Elon was determined. He knew that, in the end, this would be the most meaningful thing he had ever done. Not just for Mrs. Foster, but for everyone whose life she had touched. The weeks flew by faster than Elon had anticipated. Between finalizing the construction plans for the Caroline Foster Science and Discovery Center and ensuring that the event to honor Mrs. Foster remained a secret, his life had become a flurry of activity. Yet despite the busyness, Elon couldn't shake the growing excitement for the day when he would finally be able to reveal everything to Mrs. Foster. Every detail of the event was meticulously planned, and he was confident it would be the surprise of a lifetime. But he knew it would be an emotional journey for her. Mrs. Foster had always been proud and self-sufficient, and to see just how much her students had achieved with her guidance would surely overwhelm her. The first major step in Elon's plan was the event itself. Elon had reached out to dozens of Mrs. Foster's former students, and the response was overwhelming. Many had traveled from across the country and even from other parts of the world to attend. These were people whose lives she had shaped in ways that could not be measured, from the engineers at NASA to the doctors saving lives in hospitals around the world. The event would serve as a powerful reminder of Mrs. Foster's lasting impact. But Elon also wanted the event to be more than just a celebration. It needed to be a testament to her legacy. After much deliberation, Elon decided to host the event in a private venue, a spacious hall with a warm, intimate atmosphere that would allow everyone to share their stories and memories. The attendees would speak about how Mrs. Foster had affected their lives, recounting the moments in her classroom when they had been inspired, encouraged, and believed in. The goal was not just to show Mrs. Foster that she had made a difference, it was to help her understand the depth of her influence. In the meantime, Elon had also arranged the perfect surprise for Mrs. Foster. After the event, when she was filled with emotion and undoubtedly moved by the outpouring of gratitude from her former students, Elon would take her to the site of the new science center. The plans for the center were nearly complete, and he knew it would be the most meaningful moment for Mrs. Foster to witness firsthand. To see the realization of her lifelong dream of a science center for underserved children, a place where young minds could explore and learn without financial barriers, would be a culmination of everything she had worked for. It would show her that her efforts had not only shaped individual lives, but had laid the foundation for something much bigger. Everything was ready. The stories were collected, the event was scheduled, and the surprise visit to the Science Center site was set. The only thing left was to make sure Mrs. Foster was completely unaware of the surprise that was coming her way. Zoe, Mrs. Foster's daughter, had been working closely with Elon to ensure that her mother wouldn't suspect anything. "I've kept it all under wraps," Zoe said in a phone call to Elon the day before the event. "She has no idea, but it's not going to be easy to pull off. Mom's always so sharp, and she'll probably figure it out eventually." Elon chuckled. "I'll be ready. We'll keep things simple tomorrow. Just focus on the surprise at the event. Once that's done, we'll take her to the site, and she won't be able to deny the impact she's had." Zoe sounded more relaxed now, though still a little apprehensive. "I know this will mean so much to her, but I also know how she is. She won't want to accept it. You're going to have to convince her that this is something she deserves." Elon nodded. "I understand, but she does deserve it, more than anyone I know." The following day, everything fell into place. The former students began arriving at the venue, many of them still in awe that they would soon be reunited with their beloved teacher. Some hadn't seen Mrs. Foster in decades, but their gratitude for her had never faded. Stories flowed freely, each person eager to share how she had inspired them to reach heights they never thought possible. Elon listened intently, his heart swelling with pride as he heard one story after another of Mrs. Foster's kindness, patience, and unyielding belief in her students. Elon had arranged for a video montage of messages from students who couldn't attend in person. It was an overwhelming display of love and admiration for the woman who had taught them not just science, but how to think critically, how to solve problems, and how to dream big. The stories included not only professional accomplishments, but personal milestones too. People who had gone on to have families, start businesses, and make contributions to their communities, all thanks to the foundation Mrs. Foster had helped build in them. As the attendees gathered, the room was filled with energy, an energy that could only come from decades of admiration for a single teacher. Elon could feel the anticipation building as Mrs. Foster's arrival neared. She had agreed to attend, of course, but only because Zoe had insisted. Elon knew that the moment Mrs. Foster walked through those doors, everything would change. Zoe had arranged for her mother to be seated at the front of the room, but she had no idea what was about to happen. As the lights dimmed, a hush fell over the crowd. Elon stood at the front of the room, ready to begin. The attendees turned their attention to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elon began, his voice strong but filled with emotion, "thank you all for coming today to celebrate a woman who changed the lives of so many of us. Today is about honoring her legacy, a legacy that has shaped the world of science, education, and innovation in ways that many of us could never fully express. Mrs. Caroline Foster, you were the teacher who believed in us when no one else did. You showed us the power of knowledge, the importance of persistence, and the value of education. But more than that, you gave us something invaluable. You gave us the confidence to follow our dreams." Elon turned to face the screen behind him, and the montage of video messages began. Faces appeared on the screen. Former students of Mrs. Foster, all speaking about how her influence had shaped their lives. Each message was heartfelt, each one a testament to Mrs. Foster's enduring impact on the world. Elon could see Mrs. Foster's face soften as she watched the videos. The woman who had always been so modest, so humble in her achievements, was now witnessing the true power of her work. Tears welled in her eyes as the video played, and Elon could see how deeply moved she was by the outpouring of love and respect from her students. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. After the videos ended, Elon turned to Zoe. "Now, we have one more thing for you, Mrs. Foster," he said gently. "A legacy that will live on, one that will carry your name and continue your work for generations to come." With that, Elon invited Mrs. Foster to stand and follow him. As they walked outside, she looked confused but excited. They made their way to the site where the Caroline Foster Science and Discovery Center was soon to be built. The site was bustling with workers, but Elon led her to a small gathering of people, including former students who had traveled to be there. "Mrs. Foster," Elon said, his voice full of warmth, "this is your legacy taking shape. The Caroline Foster Science and Discovery Center will be a place where future generations of children can learn, explore, and grow. It's a place where your vision for accessible science education will continue for years to come." Mrs. Foster stared at the sign and the blueprints, her mouth slightly agape. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. I never imagined..." Elon smiled and nodded. "This is all thanks to you, Mrs. Foster. Your influence has gone far beyond your classroom. It's changed the world." The tears she had held back finally fell, but they were tears of joy, of overwhelming pride. She turned to Elon and whispered, "I had no idea. I never realized how far my influence had reached. Thank you. Thank you so much." Elon watched her closely, knowing that this moment would stay with her forever. "You changed all of us, Mrs. Foster, and now your legacy will continue to inspire generations to come." The days that followed were a blur for Mrs. Caroline Foster. She had been moved by the outpouring of love and gratitude from her former students, but nothing compared to the overwhelming moment when she saw the sign for the Caroline Foster Science and Discovery Center. The realization that such a monumental project, one that would carry her name and her life's work forward, left her speechless. She had never imagined such a thing was possible, especially not for someone like her. A teacher who had always believed that her work was simply a part of her duty, not something that deserved recognition. The construction site for the Science Center was filled with workers and the steady hum of machinery. But for Mrs. Foster, the only sound she could hear was the beating of her heart. She stared at the sign, still trying to comprehend the enormity of what Elon had done. It was one thing to hear people speak fondly of her, to receive kind words from former students, but it was entirely different to see the tangible evidence of her influence, something that would continue long after she was gone. Elon had been right. She had never considered the full impact of her teaching, the ripple effect it had caused. She had simply been doing what she loved, teaching science, encouraging curiosity, nurturing young minds. To her, it was never about accolades or recognition. It was about the students who walked through her classroom door and left with a little more understanding of the world. But now, as she looked at the plans for the center, she realized that those small, seemingly insignificant moments in the classroom had created a lasting legacy. "You've done more than change lives," Elon said softly, standing beside her as they both gazed at the sign. "You've created a movement. This center is going to give kids, Kids who don't have the same opportunities you had, access to science, to discovery. It will give them the same belief in themselves that you gave me. Mrs. Foster wiped away a tear, still in disbelief. But I was just a teacher. I never imagined any of this. Elon smiled. That's exactly what makes you so special. You didn't do it for the recognition. You did it because you cared about your students. And that's why your influence is so far-reaching. You helped shape not just my career, but the careers of so many others. Look around. You're standing on the foundation of your work. Zoe, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. I knew it would be emotional, but I didn't realize how much this would all mean to her, she whispered to Elon. Mom's always been so humble. This is overwhelming for her. Elon turned back to Mrs. Foster, who was still staring at the sign, her hands trembling. I understand it's a lot to take in, he said gently, but you deserve this, every part of it. You've given so much of yourself to the world, and now it's time to see the fruits of that labor. This center isn't just for you, it's for all the kids who will have the chance to learn what you taught. How to think critically, how to fail and keep going, how to believe in themselves. Mrs. Foster took a deep breath, then turned to face Elon. Her voice was quiet but filled with conviction. I don't know if I've ever really understood just how much I meant to my students until today. You've shown me that my work wasn't in vain, that I've made a difference. But this is more than I could have ever imagined. I never thought I'd see something like this in my lifetime. To think that all of you, my former students, are willing to help make this happen, it's beyond anything I could ever have dreamed. Elon nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was the moment he had been working toward. The moment when Mrs. Foster would finally see the full extent of her impact. It wasn't just about helping her with a life-saving surgery. It was about showing her that her work had changed the course of so many lives. It was about giving her the recognition she had never sought but so richly deserved. As they stood there together, looking at the plans for the center, Elon thought about the many students who had written to him with their stories. They all spoke of the same thing, how Mrs. Foster had believed in them when no one else did, how she had inspired them to chase their dreams. That belief was something that couldn't be measured, something that went far beyond the science lessons she taught. It was about the way she made her students feel, the way she showed them that they could do anything if they worked hard enough. Mrs. Foster turned to Elon and Zoe, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't know how to thank you, she said, her voice cracking. I never asked for any of this. I never wanted recognition. But this is something I could never have imagined. To see all of you, my students, my children, as I've always thought of you, coming together to make something like this happen, it's more than I could ever express. Zoe stepped forward, embracing her mother tightly. You've always been my hero, Mom, she whispered, and now you're everyone's hero. Look at what you've created. You've made a difference in more lives than you could ever count. Elon smiled warmly, looking at the scene before him. The emotion in the air was palpable, and for a moment he felt a deep connection to the woman who had shaped his own path. This is your legacy, Mrs. Foster. Your dedication, your belief in your students. It has rippled through the world in ways you'll never fully know. But we're here today to show you that the impact you've had is immeasurable. And this center, it's just the beginning. Mrs. Foster nodded slowly, still processing everything. I spent so many years thinking that my job was just about teaching the next lesson, giving the next exam, preparing my students for their futures. But now, I see that it was about so much more than that. It was about helping them see their own potential. And that's what this center will do. It will give children the chance to find that belief in themselves. It will be a place where they can fail and learn, just as I taught them. Elon nodded. And it will continue your work long after you're gone, Mrs. Foster. This center will inspire generations of young minds, just as you've inspired us. They stood together for a long moment, gazing at the plans for the Science Center. Mrs. Foster, once overwhelmed by the scope of what Elon had arranged, now began to see the bigger picture. This was her legacy, a legacy that would inspire not just a few, but many generations to come. As they prepared to leave the site, Mrs. Foster turned to Elon. "I can't imagine what my life would have been like if I hadn't met all of you," she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. "But I'm so glad I did. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart," Elon smiled. "It was you, Mrs. Foster, who taught us that we can do anything, as long as we believe in ourselves. We just needed someone to believe in us first. You gave us that." The weeks that followed the unveiling of the Caroline Foster Science and Discovery Center's plans were a whirlwind for Mrs. Foster. It was difficult for her to fully absorb the enormity of what had just happened. The emotions were overwhelming: pride, disbelief, and gratitude all tangled together. To see the vision of a lifetime come to fruition, to witness so many former students who had gone on to become leaders in their fields, all gathered to honor her, left her in awe. She had always believed in the power of education, but never in her wildest dreams did she imagine it would lead to something as monumental as this. As the construction of the center moved forward, Elon remained involved, ensuring that everything was aligned with Mrs. Foster's vision. He had worked tirelessly, coordinating with architects, engineers, and educators, making sure that the center would not only be a state-of-the-art facility, but also a place where children from underserved communities could learn, explore, and dream just as Mrs. Foster had encouraged her students to do. The goal was clear: to make science and education accessible to everyone, no matter their background. While Elon continued to oversee the project's development, Mrs. Foster had become increasingly involved. Although she had been hesitant at first, the notion of having her name attached to such a grand project still felt foreign to her. She was used to being behind the scenes, guiding her students, helping them succeed, and pushing them to reach their full potential. But to have this center, this testament to her life's work, carry her name was a humbling experience. Over time, Mrs. Foster began to embrace the idea. She was no longer simply a teacher who had influenced a handful of students. She was now a symbol of the impact that one person, dedicated to education and to others, could make. The idea that her work would live on in the form of this center, that future generations of students would benefit from the same belief in themselves that she had instilled in her students, filled her with a quiet joy. It was a joy that came from knowing that her work was never really finished. It had only just begun. Mrs. Foster spent many hours at the construction site, visiting the work in progress and meeting with the team that Elon had assembled to ensure the center would reflect her ideals. She worked alongside them, offering ideas, making suggestions, and even sitting in on some of the educational workshops that had begun to take shape. It was clear to everyone who met her that her dedication to education had not waned, despite her years in retirement. In fact, if anything, it had deepened. There was a quiet satisfaction in Mrs. Foster's eyes as she walked through the construction site, imagining what the finished product would look like. She could picture the classrooms, the labs, the outdoor exhibits that would inspire future generations of students. She could see the children, curious, eager, and full of wonder, walking through the halls of the Science Center, just as she had once walked through the classrooms of Peltoria Boys High School, looking for answers and a sense of purpose. One day, as Mrs. Foster walked through the nearly finished structure, she turned to Elon, who had joined her for the visit. "I never expected this," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "It's one thing to teach your students, to help them grow and succeed. But to know that I've had an impact on this scale, I can hardly believe it." Elon smiled, his voice warm. "You've done more than teach, Mrs. Foster. You've shaped the future. You've shaped all of us. This center is just the physical representation of the belief you instilled in your students. It's not about the building or the name. It's about the lives you've touched." Mrs. Foster paused for a moment, taking in the words. "I always thought my job was to help my students find their own path," she said, her voice steady but reflective. "I never imagined that my path would lead to something like this, something so permanent." Elon chuckled. "Sometimes we don't see the impact of our work until much later, and when we do, it's often bigger than we ever imagined." Mrs. Foster nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've always believed in the power of small actions. It's the little things we do every day, helping a student after class, offering words of encouragement, giving them the space to fail and learn, that can make the biggest difference. I never expected that those small moments would add up to something this grand." Elon looked at her with admiration. That's the beauty of it. You didn't set out to change the world. You set out to change lives, one student at a time. And you've done that in ways that will last far longer than any of us could have imagined. Mrs. Foster smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I don't know what to say. I'm overwhelmed, but also grateful. Grateful that I got to be a part of something so meaningful. Grateful for the students who trusted me to help them see their potential. And grateful for you, Elon, for helping me realize the full extent of my own impact. Elon's smile softened. You don't need to thank me. You've earned this. And the students you've helped, they'll carry your legacy forward, just as you carried theirs. As they continued walking through the center, Mrs. Foster turned to Elon, a renewed sense of purpose in her eyes. I'm not finished yet, she said, her voice filled with conviction. There's still so much to do. I want to make sure that this place continues to live up to the ideals I've always held. I want to see children discover the joy of learning. I want them to understand that failure is just a step toward success, that knowledge is a tool to improve the world around them. And I want to make sure that every student who comes through these doors knows that they can achieve anything they set their mind to, just like I taught them. Elon looked at her, filled with admiration. I have no doubt that you'll make it happen. This center is just the beginning of your next chapter. And with everything you've done already, I know it will be everything you dreamed of, and more. Mrs. Foster smiled, her heart full as she watched the workers continue their tasks, the center slowly taking shape. She had spent decades teaching in classrooms, working tirelessly to inspire her students. But now she had built something even bigger, a place that would continue to inspire and shape the future, far beyond what she could have ever imagined. The legacy of Caroline Foster wasn't just in the lessons she taught, it was in the lives she changed, the dreams she nurtured, and the future she had helped build. And now, as the Caroline Foster Science and Discovery Center neared its completion, she knew that her work had truly made a difference that would be felt for generations to come. The grand opening of the Caroline Foster Science and Discovery Center was a day Mrs. Foster would never forget. It was a crisp, bright morning, and the air buzzed with excitement. The center, which had been a dream for so many years, was finally ready to welcome its first visitors. Mrs. Foster stood at the entrance, her heart racing with a mix of anticipation and gratitude. She was surrounded by her former students, many of whom had traveled from far and wide to be there for this monumental occasion. The center itself was everything she had hoped for, and more. The sleek, modern design incorporated large windows that bathed the building in natural light. Inside, the space was alive with the energy of discovery. Interactive exhibits lined the halls, showcasing everything from renewable energy to the wonders of space exploration. The center was designed to be a place where children could come to learn, explore, and discover the joy of science, just as she had taught her students all those years ago. Elon stood beside her, watching as people milled around, waiting for the ceremony to begin. He could see the pride in Mrs. Foster's eyes, a sense of fulfillment that had been years in the making. This was more than just a building. It was a living, breathing legacy of her life's work, a place that would inspire future generations in the same way she had inspired her students. Are you ready? Elon asked, his voice full of warmth. Mrs. Foster nodded, her smile a little shaky but genuine. I think so. I never thought I'd see something like this in my lifetime. It's hard to believe it's all real. You earned it, Elon said, his voice sincere. You've done more than you'll ever know. This is just the beginning of what your legacy will become. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was a simple yet powerful affair. Mrs. Foster stood in front of a large crowd of her former students, friends, and community members. The ribbons stretched across the entrance, a symbolic gesture marking the official opening of the center. As the countdown began, the crowd fell silent in anticipation. When the moment arrived, Mrs. Foster took a deep breath and with a steady hand, cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted into applause as the doors to the center swung open, revealing the bright, inviting space inside. The excitement in the air was palpable, and Mrs. Foster felt a rush of emotion wash over her. This wasn't just her achievement. It was the achievement of everyone who had believed in her, supported her, and helped her along the way. As she walked through the doors of the center for the first time, Mrs. Foster looked around, her eyes taking in every detail. The main hall was vast and welcoming, filled with exhibits that reflected her passion for science and learning. A display on renewable energy stood near the entrance, with solar panels and wind turbines demonstrating the principles she had taught her students all those years ago. In the back of the room, a large model of the solar system hung from the ceiling, a reminder of the dreams Mrs. Foster had always encouraged her students to pursue, dreams of reaching beyond the stars. As the day wore on, Mrs. Foster greeted old friends and former students, sharing memories and stories about the impact they had all had on one another. She was surrounded by faces she hadn't seen in years, but it was as if no time had passed. The bonds they had formed in her classroom were still strong, and the gratitude they expressed for her guidance and belief in them was evident in every conversation. At one point, Rachel, the NASA engineer, approached Mrs. Foster with a wide smile. "You did it," Rachel said, her voice full of pride. "You've created something that will change the lives of so many students, just like you changed mine." Mrs. Foster's eyes softened, and she wrapped Rachel in a warm embrace. "I never expected any of this, but I'm so glad I did what I did. It's not just about teaching science, it's about teaching belief. I wanted my students to know that they could do anything, that they could make a difference, and now I see that they have." Nearby, Marcus, the pediatric surgeon, approached with his young daughter in tow. "You taught me that the true measure of success is not in awards or recognition, but in how many lives you've touched," Marcus said. "This center is the embodiment of everything you've taught me. It's not just a building, it's a place where children can see their potential, just like you helped me see mine." Fabo, the environmental scientist, came next, his voice filled with emotion. "I remember the first time you talked to me about protecting the planet. You showed me that even the smallest act of kindness can have a huge impact. This center will inspire children to do the same." Elon stood back, watching Mrs. Foster as she spoke to her former students. He could see how deeply moved she was by the outpouring of love and appreciation. This was the moment she had worked for all her life, a moment where she could finally see the impact of her work, the legacy she had created, and the lives she had touched. Later in the afternoon, as the visitors began to wander through the exhibits, Elon and Mrs. Foster found a quiet corner of the center. They sat together, taking it all in. The sense of fulfillment in the air was palpable. This wasn't just the culmination of a building project. It was the fulfillment of a dream that had been years in the making. "You've done something incredible here, Elon," Mrs. Foster said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've given me the chance to see my work come to life in a way I never thought possible." Elon smiled, his eyes filled with respect. "You did it, Mrs. Foster. All I did was help make it happen. The real credit goes to you. This center is your legacy, one that will inspire children for generations to come." Mrs. Foster looked around at the people who had gathered to honor her, at the children who would soon benefit from the center's programs, and she felt a deep sense of peace. This was her life's work come full circle. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the children whose lives she had changed, the dreams she had helped nurture, and the future she had helped shape. "I spent so many years teaching my students how to think for themselves, how to challenge the status quo," Mrs. Foster said, her voice soft. "But now I see that my greatest lesson was teaching them to believe in themselves. And that belief, this center, is going to carry on long after I'm gone." Elon nodded, knowing she was right. Her impact would never be forgotten. It was a legacy that would live on in the minds and hearts of every child who walked through the doors of the Caroline Foster Science and Discovery Center. The world was forever changed, not by the building, but by the woman who had inspired it all. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the center, Mrs. Foster stood up and looked out over the crowd, her heart full. "This," she whispered to herself, "is what it's all about.